Thanks everyone for joining this talk. So my talk is going to be based on my PhD, which I recently completed. And the plan for the next 15 minutes is to share an overview of the study, a bit about the context in which the study was completed, and just provide a narrative of my findings, not necessarily honing in on one particular finding, although I'm more than happy to do that for future presentations. So in terms of a bit of context, broadly speaking, we're talking about the sport for development sector here. And what I mean by that is, in terms of defining the area, is it's a broad field of activity that uses sport and physical activity in various different ways, almost as a tool for intervention. Predominantly with young people, to try and promote sport and health outcomes, so kind of using sport for non-sporting objectives. So that might be around empowering females, that might be around peace building activities, employability. And what we tend to find is this kind of use of sport for non-sporting objectives can be used in a UK domestic context, but it's largely used as well in an international context, which is the focus of this study. So predominantly we're looking at here about the divide between the global north, so the countries coloured in blue there, often deliver a range of interventions in the global south using sport as the tool to do so. So in terms of the study aim, the overarching aim really of the study was to provide a critical examination of the power relations within and between two sport for development partnerships. So specifically looking at two things, so the relationships and the practices between the partners, and the partners are international non-governmental organisations located in the global north, and their in-country stakeholder that they work with in the global south. So the context, which I'll come on to shortly, is Cameroon. So it's essentially looking at the relationships and practices between international NGOs in the global north and their in-country stakeholders in Cameroon. So just a quick note on that then, the study didn't aim to examine if the programs worked, but rather how the partnerships and programs worked on a kind of day-to-day basis. So what happened in terms of the kind of relationships between the two organisations. So not necessarily looking at the end user in terms of the young people and children who were participants on the programme, more in terms of the kind of partnerships of how these function. So in terms of the rationale, what we've kind of got here is that in the last couple of decades there's been a huge growth in the number of international NGOs that are using sport as a kind of way to tackle broader social and health outcomes, particularly in developing countries, and especially in sub-Saharan Africa. So kind of what we've got here is we've got this growth over the last 2 decades, but we've also got a real prominent criticism of the sector, that as with broader international development, that these kind of relationships and practices might be exacerbating unequal relationships of power between the global north and the global south. So what we're kind of doing here is kind of providing, filling a gap within the literature that looks at what the local considerations are. So you'll see from the data that I present that the majority of the data I gathered was from a local Cameroonian perspective, because previous literature, most of the previous literature has been developed and written from a global north point of view. So yeah, it very much kind of plays into that rationale to provide a localized understanding to how this sector operates. So one of the first questions I tend to get asked is why Cameroon? And there's kind of a number of reasons for that. So there is a distinct lack of sport for development research in Cameroon. The kind of big focus for sport for development research in Africa tends to be countries like Tanzania, Zambia, Kenya, Cameroon has an emerging sector. So like I say, there's a lack of research. So that was a kind of different angle to approach. Probably importantly, I had considerable practitioner experience in Cameroon. So in terms of developing local networks, contacts, I've spent 4 years as a practitioner working with local stakeholders in Cameroon. So I had some local understanding. And Cameroon kind of offers a real kind of new setting. It's a country that's got a complex history. It's got a very messy colonial heritage, which is kind of played out in a contemporary context. So for example, the last time I was out in Cameroon collecting data was right at the kind of start of the most recent internal conflict and kind of protests and riots. So it's a bit of a volatile country, but it provides a very new context for sport for development research. So how did I go about the study? Well, I set it up with 2 comparative case studies looking at 2 different partnerships. So the first partnership was a US-based international NGO with their Cameroonian stakeholder, and they use football as an intervention to talk about gender equality, HIV/AIDS awareness, employability skills. So a real broad kind of range of desired outcomes. And the second partnership is between a UK international NGO and their Cameroonian stakeholder, and they use cricket as the tool to really focus on HIV and AIDS education messages. So how did I go about it? Well, I immersed myself in the Cameroonian context. I conducted multiple field trips to Cameroon and really took on the role as an active participant. So for example, in between interviews, I was kind of you know, helping out with a variety of different things with the local stakeholder organisations, living locally with local families, kind of really immersing myself in the Cameroonian culture. I was also very conscious that I didn't want to perpetuate any of the kind of issues to do with power and power inequality. So I was very reflective of my own positionality, particularly my invisible backpack, Macintosh calls it, in terms of being white, British, female, you know, kind of very much standing out in a Cameroonian community. In terms of data, there were a range of semi-structured interviews with international NGO practitioners and local practitioners in Cameroon. So football coaches, cricket coaches, administrators within the local stakeholder organisation, as well as a thematic analysis of NGO documents. So in total, there are around 20 documents that were analysed and over 90 hours of audio from the semi-structured interviews. So I'm not going to focus on the theories too much, but I certainly can do it at a later point. I drew on several theories of power, which enabled me to kind of provide a holistic analysis of power that kind of looked at both positive and negative outcomes for local Cameroonian practitioners. So what I'm going to do now is present the findings in relation to the research questions. So, like I say, this is a very kind of broad overview of the findings, but the first research question that I had looked at the intentions of the international NGOs. So it was a case of what are the principal features and intentions of these organisations in Cameroon? What are they aiming to achieve? And so, as you can imagine, unsurprisingly, the documents that I analysed, so websites, organisational strategic documents, delivery plans, they were full, they were kind of laced with positive participatory intentions around the use of sport, combining it with health and social messages, very much that they wanted to work and empower local communities. They wanted to foster behaviour change, so whether that was around issues to do with HIV/AIDS awareness, you know, kind of maybe change young people's perceptions around gender equality. Very much the language talked about encouraging local decisions and striving for a year-round programme of activity, as well as having inclusive access for all. That be from a cultural point of view in terms of Anglophones and Francophones, because there's a big divide within Cameroon, but also from a gender point of view as well. So unsurprisingly, the kind of first finding for the first research question was, okay, look, everyone's being very positive here. However, the documents were supplemented with interviews with staff, with practitioners who worked for the international NGOs. And so the interviews actually indicated that the structure of the partnerships facilitated in the main a one-directional transfer of knowledge, concepts and values, quite hierarchical in terms of the structure. Same in terms of the decision making. So the resources and where they went, that was very much driven by the international NGOs. So like the flow of volunteers from the UK or the US into Cameroon, these decisions were very much driven by the international NGO, as were the kind of financial resources and how to go about monitoring and evaluating the success of the programmes. The interviews indicated that there was little local consultation on the need for the programme, and there was certainly an awful that there was a lack of local input on what the actual programme looked like in terms of the programme design. Now, practices regarding the delivery of the programme very much varied between the two partnerships. One international NGO adopted a kind of volunteerism approach where UK volunteers travel to Cameroon for 2 weeks of the year and intensively deliver a programme, whereas the US example, who use football, they employ a Cameroonian team of full-time paid staff to manage the programme in Cameroon, but then rely on kind of volunteers within Cameroon to also supplement that. So the kind of first question was around, you know, what are the principal features of the international NGOs? Well, there was a bit of contradiction there. So we've kind of got all this data from the global north, from the international NGOs, and what I really want to do is kind of contrast that with localized views to really kind of feed into the kind of need for this local voice, this local narrative. So the next two research questions, there were 3 research questions in total. The second question focused on, well, what are the local challenges and responses from a Cameroonian point of view in terms of the relationship with the international NGO? So it's kind of 4 major themes that came out here. So the first theme was around, well, local Cameroonian practitioners, they have this perception that the international NGOs are the experts, and there's this kind of widespread acceptance of this donor-recipient relationship, which we find within the kind of broader international development sector. Bolted onto that are an awful lot of race-based assumptions about the international NGO practitioners, and you can see from the quote there from Sebastian, that's difficult findings to read, but not uncommon, unfortunately. So Sebastian, very kind of representative here, saying whenever you see a white, meaning white person, in a particular direction, we always believe in that white, because you know that those people are more advanced than us in everything. It is true, it is normal. So there's this kind of acceptance, there's these kind of embedded race-based assumptions. But what we've got with that is not a full acceptance. There's also some frustration locally that the international NGOs don't really understand the Cameroonian realities. You know, some of the visitors to Cameroon stay in kind of westernized hotels, they travel in air-conditioned minibuses, so they don't really know what the Cameroonian realities are. Finally, in terms of this research question, what we did find was that the local practitioners did show some, if limited, agency, because they drew on their relationships that they had with the international NGO to kind of benefit themselves, both personally and professionally. So that might be gaining a promotion at work, expanding their personal contacts and networks. So I kind of very much played into the kind of social capital, building stocks of social capital was a kind of real sort of key finding there. However, this kind of development of social capital was very much based on their relationship with the international NGO, and was very much founded on these race-based assumptions that they had an association with the whites. Is kind of the main like the main kind of response that I got there. So we've kind of looked at what the challenges and responses are with the relationship. And next we kind of turn to, well, what are the challenges and responses to actually delivering these programs on a day-to-day basis? And the findings of this third question were kind of split into two, because local practitioners in Cameroon told me repeatedly that, well, firstly, there were a range of domestic issues within Cameroon which kind of prevented them or made it difficult for them to deliver these sport for development programs. So, I mean, firstly, the ongoing socio-political instability. You know, schools were closed down, there were protests, there were riots, there was, particularly in the Anglophone regions, there was a lack of internet connection, there were curfews in some communities. So it's a real issue, particularly in the Anglophone regions. In Cameroon, there's a contrasting emphasis on sport with, from a cultural point of view, in terms of the Anglophones and Francophone Cameroonians. So for Francophone Cameroonians, sport is very much, it's embedded in their education system. It's an examination topic, whereas it isn't within the Anglophone education system. They kind of follow on through with the kind of two colonial education systems that were embedded many decades ago. So that basically there's issues in terms of encouraging Anglophone children to participate in these programs. Another one there is gendered inequality. Now, you can see from the quotation there from Michael that that's very representative of the traditional views that the Cameroonian practitioners are facing. So mothers taught them that girls should stay in the house and do cooking. The boys can go out. It's the culture, actually. The culture, mothers think to keep the children at home so they can cook. They don't find it normal for a girl child to be going to do sports. So while we've got the kind of desire and the intention to increase participation for girls, there's a kind of contextual domestic issue here that's kind of embedded within society. On top of that is that, you know, the topic of something like HIV and AIDS is a very taboo topic within Cameroon. And so these are some of the kind of headline issues that the practitioners face. They also face some challenges in terms of what the international NGOs kind of formal discourse, website, strategy, delivery plan suggests. So the first one being that there's a kind of problem that the international NGOs want to push the sustainability of these programs are very much driven by Cameroonian volunteers. However, because Cameroon's in the global south, it's a low to middle income country, volunteering isn't on the agenda. It isn't culturally acceptable to really go and volunteer. People have multiple jobs, and so they don't have the luxury, for want of a better word, to actually go and volunteer. I'll come back to the middle box there. I'm just going to talk a little bit about the age and maturity of participants. There was an issue with the international NGOs' discourse in their kind of programme, in their curriculum that they'd written, in that there was no differentiation around age or the maturity of participants. Let me give you an example that the curriculum written by the international NGO might have talked about messages around HIV and AIDS. However, the same message would be delivered to a primary school child as it would be to an 18, 19-year-old. And when we're talking around issues of, you know, abstaining from sex, using a condom, kind of safe sexual practices, that's really concerning and a huge challenge for local practitioners who are delivering these programs on a day-to-day basis. And then finally here, the kind of major problem is we've kind of got two very different sports. Football is like a religion in Cameroon. Everyone lives and breathes football. The problem with football, though, is a kind of delivery tool, is that a lot of young people just want to play competitive football. They're not necessarily interested, this is what practitioners told me, around these kind of bolt-on messages, around the kind of health messages, the social messages. contrasting that with cricket, cricket is very new in Cameroon, and in some communities, as you can see from the quote from Patrick, they really don't even know what cricket is. When you enter an institution, meaning school, they say that, and you say you'd like to introduce cricket, they will tell you what is that, cricket, and they will liken it to a cricket, an insect. People will say that being an insect, how can you play that? So you have to then go and explain. That has been a huge challenge. So we've kind of got two contrasting sports here that are being used as the delivery tool. So to kind of summarise, we've kind of got this inconsistent and contradictory discourse from the international NGOs. They are positioned as the experts. However, there is some local frustration by Cameroonian practitioners. But there are some positive consequences that come out of the relationship, albeit they're drawn on race-based assumptions. And then finally, we see that both the domestic context and the international NGOs' formal discourse presents a range of challenges to actually deliver these programmes on a day-to-day basis. And then finally, there were kind of three recommendations that kind of came out of the thesis. Firstly, that the international NGOs review their programme objectives to consider the local realities and the local needs, so more local consultation. Secondly, to ensure that if volunteers, if practitioners from the UK and US do visit Cameroon, that they are better trained, that they really understand the local context before they arrive. So a lot of kind of work around training there. And thirdly, which is a kind of much longer term shift, which is around decolonising knowledge. So rather than the majority of the decisions sitting with the international NGO, to very much kind of have a bit more of a true partnership approach and try to decolonise knowledge. So that, in a nutshell, is my PhD study. So I'll happily take any questions that anybody might have.
Thanks very much, Joe. Very interesting talk. It's going to open up to the floor for questions. Do you have any questions for Joe?
I have a. Hi, Joe.
Oh, sorry, go on, Joe.
Oh, hey, Chris.
Go on, somebody else just waved their hand. Sorry, I was late, by the way. I was struggling to connect.
Go on, Chris, fire away.
Yeah, okay, I'll kick off. Joe, I have a couple of questions in mind, but I'll just ask one, and then if there's time at the end, I'll maybe ask the second. How confident are you that your research is actually going to have the impact? I mean, how confident are your recommendations that you mentioned there at the end are actually going to be taken forward? And what are the mechanisms for that?
Yeah, so at the end of data collection and the kind of write-up, I've had regular dialogue with both international NGOs and offered to share findings, one of which has taken me up on that. So yeah. I guess kind of moving forward, it's a case of kind of seeing what they can do with those recommendations and kind of maintaining that relationship, because, you know, if there's no change or action that can be brought about, then, you know, that would be a little bit disappointing. So I failed to mention at the beginning, both international NGOs were on board from the outset of the PhD. So like I say, I've kind of maintained some regular dialogue with them throughout the course and kind of offered to share findings, one of which so far has taken me up on that.
Are you able to say which one?
The football partnership. So
football, yeah, great. Good luck.
Jeff, do you have a question?
Thanks, Joe. Really interesting presentation there. I'm wondering, Joe, how transferable is this to other countries? Because I think one of the key or the golden threads through your talk is to have a really localized knowledge of what is going on in terms of people and systems and cultures. Is there a core element that you can plug into other nations and cultures?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, whilst there are some specific Cameroonian kind of take-home messages and kind of issues around the kind of context, there are some general mechanisms that I think can be applicable to different countries and different contexts that are using sport and physical activity in this way. You know, this kind of local consultation, encouraging localised voices, scratching beneath the surface really of the formal discourse, so not just taking for granted what the glossy brochures say, what the website says, what the kind of participatory positive language says. I suppose that's probably the kind of skeptic in me, but kind of scratching beneath the surface and trying to find out from the coalface, from those that are delivering these programs on a day-to-day basis, how they work, and yeah, what the challenge is.
So I'm just wondering, Joe, that there's probably good opportunities and probably a lot of interest in our partners at the Trove, you know, for looking at social inclusion and, you know, across Australia. So we pick that up and talk more about that in future.
Of course, yeah.
Stuff. Chris, do you have a second question? Or?
Oh gosh, I think yeah, I suppose this is, Joe, it's more of a methodological question. Would it be fair to say that you, as the researcher, you were sort of semi-detached from what you were researching, in that, or were you really close to what was going on the ground? And that was, yeah.
Okay.
How would you describe that relationship?
Yeah, I guess just kind of pick that up. That was quickly then, just to answer that, I had a relationship. I worked for one of the international NGOs for a number of years, 4 years before I embarked on the PhD study. So that also formed part of my rationale to have a second case study. So I wanted one partnership that I was aware of, had some kind of prior knowledge of, but then I wanted a kind of contrast to that, where I had kind of no prior contacts, networks, and kind of was going in cold, for want of a better word. Methodologically, I mean, I didn't want to perpetuate the kind of issues that I was investigating, so I kind of took some key decisions. I worked with local research assistants, which was part of the Cameroonian government's kind of green light to allow me to kind of carry out research in Cameroon. So we always had local guides, local research assistants with me. Reflective diaries were really useful, and kind of consulting the local stakeholder organisation on my PhD study, on even down to the level of what the interview questions would kind of look like. So really working through the local gatekeepers, so I wasn't kind of contradicting what I was investigating, really.
Did you feel then, by the time you'd finished the research process, did you feel like you knew as much about both organisations, or did your prior knowledge of one kind of mean that you knew more about them?
I mean, so for my first field trip, I spent more time with the organisation that I didn't know, so I would kind of really embed myself in their daily practices. I kind of lived with one of the families that kind of helped found the local organisation, and kind of really immersed myself there. So I was kind of conscious that I didn't want to kind of have any or too much kind of baggage in terms of my knowledge of the cricket organisation.
Yeah, I guess where I was heading with that was I'm interested in whether a more kind of participatory research design, kind of active action research or something similar you might consider that kind of methodology to be appropriate for this kind of
absolutely. I think, you know, like there are some aspects I claimed within my thesis that it wasn't a full participatory action research project, but there were certainly elements of it. You know, I think there's kind of all sorts of positives to kind of adopt that kind of approach, but there were kind of drawbacks in that, you know, kind of teaching post back in the UK, and kind of financial commitments to kind of be able to up sticks and go in, live in Cameroon.
Possibly disadvantages as well. Possibly, would there be disadvantages of that more participatory approach? I don't know.
Absolutely, yeah, there would be.
Thanks, Marcus.
Stuff. Okay, I think in the interest of time, we'll call it there for today. So thanks, Joe. Very interesting talk. Thanks also, James, for your talk earlier. So thanks both. Just a quick note that our next seminar is on Monday, 15th of June. That's with it's on the Share Research Cluster with Dave Broom, Caroline Dalton, and Stephen Brown. So it'd be interesting to hear from them. And I believe that's the last seminar scheduled for this academic year. So be interesting to listen to that one, and obviously then look at the seminar series for next year when we start to plan for that. So thanks all for your attendance today, and we'll see everyone soon.
Thanks, Marcus.
Thanks, Mark.
Everyone.
Thanks, Joe.
Thanks.